And then I took First Corinthians in divinity school in this room. Back in, you know her?
I guess I do.
She taught First Corinthians.
Read one of her books. She's got another one out since then.
She taught First Corinthians in here. And you got people online too. Yes. Good morning, people online. I see everybody. I have them on my screen too. Great. So good morning. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Typically you're online, so we've left our online people today. We are almost, I'm trying to pull my slides up here, but maybe here. We're more than halfway through the book of First Corinthians. And so I thought, some of you may know that I teach down the street as an adjunct at the public policy school. So I thought this might be a good time to have a midterm exam. Don't worry.
I think we have something else to do.
That's what I used to always say in school. But I thought it'd be a good time for us to do a bit of review because we've had some gaps in the sessions. I think the last time we met on First Corinthians 2 weeks ago when Morgan was here. So I thought since we're a little more than half, I think we have maybe three, Christian told me, I think we have 3 more sessions on First Corinthians. I think Luke and then Daniel and then you. So we have 3 more sessions. So I thought it'd be good for us to kind of see if we can tie all this together. And while there is no quiz, I do want us to think about what we've learned so far. So here's the map. You see Corinth here, kind of see the location. And I've put a few, are you gonna, do you want me to? Oh, please, thank you. Okay. I want us to think more about the location, the social location, the geographic location, as well as the social location for Corinth. So I put, you can just move to the next slide, please. So I want us to have a bit of a review to think about what we've learned about Corinth. And I don't know, yeah, thank you. So I'm going to stand to the side a little bit. I won't read everything, but I want us to get a sense of the place, and I want us to get a sense of the people we've been dealing with over the last several weeks. So you saw the map where Corinth is located, and you see it was a big trading center. It's a very diverse area. It's one of the larger cities in current Greece. Corinth developed a reputation for possessing wealth without culture and for abusing its poor. It was the host for the Isthmian Games, which is an athletic festival similar to the Olympics. So you can think that they had a lot of revenue that came about because think about the World Cup now. Think about the Olympics. Corinth was a place where a lot of people came, and so there was additional revenue that came into Corinth. You want to see this one? Oh, okay.
No, I can see okay.
Yeah, I was talking to Ken and people of Corinth had both growing civic pride and individualistic pride. I think that's important for us to know. The other thing that I'm not sure we talk a lot about in the past, scholars believe that 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion, Paul arrived in Corinth and preached the gospel. A community of believers was formed, and Paul stayed in Corinth for 1.5 years. And you can get a little bit of that history if you go back to Acts 18. The 18th chapter of Acts, it has at least a paragraph or 2 about Paul's stay in Corinth and how the church was actually formed. A little more about the church in Corinth. Most of the believers were Gentiles, although you see in Acts that there were a few Jews, but mostly it was a Gentile congregation. Morgan pointed this out a couple of weeks ago that Corinth had a lot of sites of pagan worship and Christian. I think when we talked about how many times we've been here before, so you know about all the temples there, especially the temple of Aphrodite, the temple of Apollo. So a lot of temples, a lot of pagan worship. that's important for us to know as we're thinking about our lessons, the lessons that we've had. The First Corinthians is a little different from some of the other Pauline letters in the sense that it was, as opposed to like Romans or a general book. This is First Corinthians and Second Corinthians are focused on issues that the Corinthian people brought up to Paul for Paul to deal with. I always want to know who Chloe's people are. We don't know who they are, but I want to know who they are. And I think Kristen's going to cover this at the end. We know that 3 people were with Paul when he wrote the letter. He was in Ephesus when he wrote the letter back to Corinthians, and they were there as well. Some people think they brought the letter. They brought the Corinthians letter. So for us and for Paul, the challenge is how to form and forge community as Christ followers within the cultural background of the new believers in the church. How to navigate conflict given their cultural context, how to reshape or re-socialize the moral imaginations of the Gentile converts into patterns of life consonant with the ways of the God of Israel. And Jack and Fran and Carol and I guess Christian, those of you who do Christian education, the reason that you picked this book is because the focus is on community. The reason Carol said she wanted us to be in this room, wanted us to be closer to form community. The reason she wanted us to talk to each other in the beginning is to help in forming community. So this is what I want us to think about in the last few sessions that we have. Think about Paul's challenge and think about our challenge in terms of forming and forging community as Christ followers. So these are the questions I wanted to talk about before we get into the how can we form and forge community as Christ followers given our differences? And we've covered enough of the book, I think, to be able to kind of opine on some of these questions. What are the challenges and how should we address the challenges and even capitalize on the opportunities? How should we deal with what I call cultural defaults? Like I mentioned, all the temples and the pagan worship. How can Paul begin to re-socialize and how do we change given our cultural context? And then I intended I didn't get a chance to, I wanted to do a word study of community, but what struck me as I looked at the word community, 2 words came out to me, and that's common, and having a common interest, and then unity. So I wanted to think about that. And then wanted to talk a little bit about this quote. Jamie Clark Souls is a scholar, teaches at Perkins. I think Fran told me about Jamie Clark Souls months ago, and then during, I guess when you all taught, you used a handout of hers, and as I looked at the handout, I found out that she had done a fairly recent book on study guide of First Corinthians. So this is her quote. So I want to think about these questions, and I want to think about this quote. And she says, community is simultaneously crucial and complicated. Community is simultaneously crucial and complicated. Name a subject about participating in community that doesn't come up in First Corinthians. Factions, sexual ethics, gender issues, money issues, class hierarchies, theological questions, how to conduct worship, and leadership questions. Paul covers it all in this letter. We've covered a lot of this so far. So you can take any question that you want to talk about. What are the challenges and how should we address the challenges and even capitalize on the opportunities in forming and forging community? We've seen the messiness of the Corinthian church over the last several weeks. Any thoughts? Any ideas about how we might?
Yeah,
Oh,
I was just, no, and this is a little off maybe, but it's related. So you mentioned earlier that these were issues that they came to him with, asking him for help in solving. And I was just wondering, to what extent do we understand how much he is like scolding them because he looks at them and he says, what a mess you are, versus
Well, not in every place. In see one of our scriptures today, he commends
them on some
so
things, right?
But it does appear, well, we've had so far,
Right,
exactly. That it does appear that he is scolding them. But in the early part, he calls them saints. So
True, yeah. So is it really coming from them? Like they're saying, we are having trouble with this.
Yes,
It's not him so much looking at them and saying, gosh, get your act
not
together.
necessarily, that he's responding.
If
He's
he really is responding to them saying, we are having some trouble.
Yes.
Okay,
And
that's
remember, this
important.
is in the first wave of Christianity. These are Gentile believers, so kind of different context. They're in the city where there's so many other things going around culturally. So you can imagine that, and it is a diverse church. I don't know if I put that in there, but it's a church that had a few wealthy people, but mostly non-wealthy people, free people, and people who were slaves. People who had come from Rome because the Claudius had thrown out a lot of people and they ended up in Corinth. So yes, he's responding. I think I said that he's responding, which makes First Corinthians a little unique. He's responding to issues that they've come up with. It would be like us having questions and going to our mother or father in the faith saying, hey, what's going on? These people are getting on my nerves. What do you think? What do you think? Can you tell me what you taught or go more into what you taught us? So that's kind of what this is.
Plus, it reminds me of the verse in Corinthians I just Googled real quick to jog my memory. But apart from these other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. I mean, Paul had such a, almost like a parental care for the well-being of each of the churches.
Right.
So much so that, he expressed it that way. Yeah.
Anybody else?
We can think of Corinthians as being 50 AD old news, but it's really not. There are tensions in many of our largest denominations. Methodists have spent 30 years trying to disentangle themselves. They finally did it this time. And then our friends, the Baptists, have started down that road as well, kicking out some of their largest congregations. So this is contemporary history in many ways.
Right. For those of us who think that we don't have our own set of messes, Jack is reminding us that we do. So I go back to all of the weeks that we've been dealing with this, any responses about how we might deal with some of this tension? Christian, you have your hand up, it's kind of halfway.
Well, it's sort of a half.
Okay, I'll call it on you. That's
Comment. Just. Yes, what Jack says is correct about the larger church. I've had in the last few weeks, several people talk about congregation at Duke Chapel to the effect that we don't have all these problems that the Corinthians have. We've really got ourselves together. I've heard this at church council meeting, there aren't major conflicts here. We love our pastor. We're a little irritated with her for retiring, but other than that, we love her. We all get along. But then at deeper level that I think the council was not, we're maybe not quite ready. We're not, because of a lot of circumstances, I don't feel like we're really a close congregation.
Anybody agree, disagree with Christian?
I definitely agree with where he's coming from because the structure of the congregation is different from a structure of a regular denomination church that is kind of like a standalone. And I think that's where some of that uniqueness comes from, where we don't deal with some of the same issues because you don't have some of the same pressures that these individual churches are facing. And I kind of though see like what Jack was saying and how, what's going on then, we can relate it to today. It's so much about all this information being out there. What are they going to do with it? And then a power struggle because you have the people in power who want to stay in power. And they don't like the fact that other Christians can be on the same level with them, even though economically or social, they're not. So it's a lot of those same things going on.
Well, let me ask you something. I've heard from you online, and it's putting out to people online. And you said one of the times we were on about our church, the congregation is not as messy as the church of Corinth. I mean, once again, thinking about starting off at Christianity, we have the advantage that we have these lessons. But I would argue that perhaps one of the reasons there's less messiness is that we don't have the same level of diversity that was located in the church of Corinth. When you have more difference, when you have more diversity, I would argue that you have more of an opportunity for tension, for difference, for how do you navigate around those differences. I think about, we were just talking over here in the get to know you session about my church, First Baptist downtown, and there are two First Baptist churches. I don't know if you're all familiar with Raleigh. There are two First Baptist churches. They have a common history. It's an African-American congregation, and then there's a white congregation. The African-American church started their own church, just went on the other side of the Capitol grounds and started First Baptist. Typically in the South, it's Second Baptist, Third Baptist, but they kept the First Baptist name. And so I would argue that in the American context, for sure, there are not many churches that have the same kind of diversity that the Church of Corinth had. This church doesn't reflect City of Durham. I was thinking about this in the lesson, when we were preparing the lesson. I didn't put a slide up, but City of Durham, interestingly, in terms of demographic breakdown, it has about 38% white, 35% African American, 15% Hispanic, 5% Asian. So if this congregation reflected like the Church of Corinth reflected its geographic location, this room may look a little different. And so that's one of the things I wanted to think about it. And one of my questions, how should we deal with cultural difference? I was thinking also about the ministerial staff here at the chapel. Different denominations, Carol's Presbyterian, Dean Powery, raised as a Pentecostal, but ordained as a Baptist. Raquel is ordained Baptist. Ken's Lutheran, Christians, Methodist, United Methodist. So I've always wondered how the ministerial staff kind of navigates through those differences. There are differences there. And I noticed in the search information, you call yourselves an interdenominational, as opposed to non-denominational, interdenominational fellowship. And so given those differences, while we don't have a lot of messiness now, but I think if there was more diversity, perhaps there might be more tension around differences. Just a thought.
Well, there's also age. I think the ages in the church that Paul would be dealing with likely were more diverse than this congregation.
And this congregation probably, as a general matter, everybody fits into the same general economic thing. Unlike the Church of Corinth. So that want us to think about, yes.
And just one last thing, just that most everybody in this congregation came from somewhere else. And so might be extremely familiar with the kinds of things that you've just been talking about.
Right.
And found a kind of safe space here. Because just because you're in this particular space right now, doesn't mean they're not very familiar with all those conflicts, because everybody grew up somewhere else.
Yes.
And if you grew up in a small town in the South, you know exactly what all that stuff is.
Exactly.
Even if you are not still living there and you happen to be able to come to the chapel.
Right.
So that's all.
Let me also say, we as a congregation have not been conflict-free. In our history, there was a knockdown, drag-out fight about finances at one point, which involved people leaving the church. There was there was a failed search prior to my arrival that resulted in serious disagreements and people leaving. So we've not been conflict-free.
So we've had our messes.
We had our messes too. Even with our homogeneity, we fought. So.
we may have a big, I hope God, but may have a big conflict possibility when, in terms of fitting the new pastor.
Well, that means we're studying this book. Studying what's written the right time. One other thing before we move on to the text. One thing I was surprised somebody has mentioned, because these are issues that came up in our earlier discussion. What about the issue of freedom and rights? That was an issue 2 weeks ago. What about the issue of love? I'm going to talk a little more about that going in the next few weeks. But the issue of love has come up. The issue of the cross, the logic of the cross, the logic of love, those issues have come up. How do we look at those issues as informing how we deal with the challenges around community? That's what we think about community. What is it? And we're going to talk about it a little more today, but we've talked about this in the past, yes.
It's not clear to me what you mean by cultural default and how that relates to community.
Like you said, we all have come from somewhere and we've been socialized a certain way.
Okay.
And we think of things a certain way based on our cultural context. And so when you come in community, you bring, but my husband's on here, so he's a sociologist, a little bit Ross. And so I hear him talk a lot about, we bring our scripts to the table. We bring what we've learned to the table, and part of community is sorting through all that.
Okay.
Sorting through all of that. How do you make community work? Like in the church of Corinth, you had slaves, you had free people. You'll see in the lesson today with the Lord's Supper. The rich people acted like they always acted.
Okay, I understand. I mean, I had to deal with that from day one, or from when I was very young, because I was born in South America. My parents were both from South America. I grew up in Southeast Asia. I lived for 12 years, and I was exposed to local culture. And I attended an American international school. So I was always seeing that, and I've always accepted differences. So it doesn't seem to me, normal is accepting. But I see what you're saying. And then I lived in other states in the U.S. and I see someone from a small town in a rural Midwest state, and so they just put them, that's normal. So I guess your question, you're saying, how do we address that? And for me, when I read here, if we say that Corinth, yes, has this huge diversity, rich, poor, you name it, how did they deal with it? Well, they had a leader, and the leader was Paul. So is there a leader today here or among
Paul was
us?
there for part of the time.
It could be a leader.
Paul wasn't really there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my question. That's how it comes to me. Well, we need a leader.
He's kind of like a catalyst in that case, you might think of. Because they were just kind of a blob and then he came in and you were asking about love. It started this part of the conversation. I think, the agape kind of love, that's what underpins any community. So when we think about our own congregation, when we think about Corinth, is it there?
Well, that was the first thing that popped into my mind, was because I think in any situation, you want to depend on the teachings of Christ and how he wants us to approach things. And I think love is an answer, can be the first answer really in every situation, is approach it with a loving heart, a loving mind, being open, willing to listen, willing to also express your own thoughts, not getting offended or being defensive, but just like letting the ideas get out there so that you can see where the common ground is and where there is the unity and what needs to be worked out.
And the word that comes to mind, and I probably have it somewhere else on the slide, countercultural. Countercultural. That being a Christ follower, I think that's one of the themes throughout the book. Paul is telling them, no matter where you've come from, to be a Christ follower means you to do something different, perhaps, than what you're accustomed to do. That's kind of what you're getting. So let's get into the text. Chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10, we're going to spend a lot of time on chapter 10. I think Carolyn and Preacher kind of chopped this up, but chapter 10.
I'll exonerate Carol on that. She asked me to do it and I did it and you're stuck with it.
Right. I was thinking, but I picked this, because I was one of the early people that picked it. I picked 11 because of the Lord's Supper. I didn't look at the rest of them. And it turns out that it's a lot of problems in the ones I picked, but nevertheless. So 10 completes this section and more is started in chapters 8 and 9. And then chapter 11 begins the new section on worship, 11 through 14. Which I think Ruth and Daniel will talk about in the coming weeks. And then the last 15 and 16 will be Christian stuff. That's usual. So let's kind of end this. I wanted to just give some highlights on the food sacrifice to idols. Anything we remember from the discussion 2 weeks ago? I pulled out this verse because I think, once again, we talked about love. I think this was one of the key verses in that section in chapter 8. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge, but anyone who loves God is known by him. And then the key points: we take care of this liberty of yours, freedom of yours, does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. How you treat others, especially the weak, is registered as how they treat Christ. So by your knowledge, those weak believers for whom Christ died are destroyed. Therefore, food is a cause of their falling. Paul says, I will never eat meat. Any other things you want to add from 2 weeks ago? Let's move on to wrapping this section. So chapter 10 wraps up. Sorry. So one of the things that he does talk about in chapter 10 relates to fleeing from the worship of idols. I'd like to get a reader just to read these 4 or 5 verses. Maybe get somebody online so they can become part of our conversation. Starting with, therefore, beloved, flee from the worship of idols. Or reader, please. Anybody else?
I've got it.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Lynn,
Yes,
would you like for me to read that? This is Bunny.
please, Bunny.
Therefore, my beloved, free from the worship of idols. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless is it not a sharing of the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a sharing of the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices partners in the altar? What do I imply then? That food sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or are we provoking the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?
Great, thank you, Bunny. So, what leads, those underlines are mine, those emphases are mine, because I think we want to focus in on those sections, I believe. Focus on any section you want, but those are the ones I kind of picked down. What do you think this means, kind of within the context of what we talked about 2 weeks ago?
Like you said in the beginning, we're just at the beginning of Christianity. we haven't worked everything out yet. We haven't worked very much out at all yet. What about these who live in polytheistic culture, sacrificing, and pretty soon they're gonna ask you to sacrifice to the emperor, and if you don't do it, you're in real trouble. They're not real gods anyway, so, you know, what's the harm in sacrificing to them? Some people probably are saying, we've been doing it all our lives. And Paul is very resistant to that. I've got a daughter who's a Buddhist Christian. Right now she's at Buddhist meditation. That works for her. Should I be okay with that? She says it's perfectly compatible with Christianity, and in fact, she had one Buddhist Christian meditation group she went to that was at a Catholic university, and one of the leader was a Catholic priest. And I mean, that may be my tricky question for today. And they had a lot of the similar tricky questions then.
Right, and I think a couple of weeks ago we talked about it, it might have been online, we talked about this. So when you went to Corinth, there were a lot of, at the temples, there were a lot of chairs because people ate there. And so one of the issues underlying this section is that even after you become a Christian, it's part of the culture, part of the civil religion to go into the temples. And so one of the questions is, even though I'm a Christian and perhaps I don't believe in idols, is it all right for me to go? And is it all right for me to eat the food that's been sacrificed to idols? Now that I think differently, it'd be similar if your daughter said, why don't you come and go with me to my service, to my session, to my, and what does that mean for you in terms of where you are? So those are kind of the issues that they're dealing with. Anybody else?
Put it another way, there's a subtext here, and the subtext is two questions. What is orthodoxy, and does it really matter anyway?
And I guess related to that is, it doesn't matter if you're weak or strong, because Paul talks about it too. What do you do if your so-called weaker brother or sister is more affected by some of these issues? What do you as the stronger person do? And I think Paul's kind of clear about what you're doing. I think it's on the next slide. The other thing, another verse I wanted to pull out, it's kind of backwards, but I thought it fit better here. And it's about the whole issue of testing. So if you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure. One of my favorite verses. And then this is what Richard Hayes, who is emeritus here, in his commentary, what he said, and I thought it was important to pull that out. This chapter raises a warning for us to scrutinize our small compromises with the cultural systems around us. When we find ourselves in the face of some dubious invitation or opportunity, saying, no problem, I can handle it, I can get involved in this and still be a good Christian, we should look at Paul and remember Paul's warnings to the strong and Corinth. So something for us to think about. Next slide, please. And then finally, in the last part of chapter 10, the focus is, and I think this is Christian pulled out this verse, do all things to the glory of God. you walk into the glory bed, and this was the section I really wanted us to keep. So another, please, on the, maybe Bunny, if you want to read again, somebody online, read those verses 23 to 30, please.
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
All things are permitted, but not all things are beneficial. All things are permitted, but not all things build up. Do not seek your own advantage, but that of the other. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth and its fullness are the Lord's. If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice," then do not eat it out of consideration for the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I mean the other's conscience, not your own. For why should my freedom be subject to the judgment of someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why should I be denounced because of that for which I give thanks?
Thank you. All right, any other comments on that piece? In the section that Bunny just read? I'm once again underlining what I thought were key points. What does it mean to do something out of consideration for the one who informed you? Or should my freedom be subject to the judgment of someone else's conscience? Or all things are permitted, but not all things build up. Remember the first verse in that section, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up.
Okay, out of consideration for the one that informed you, I think it's like, if they tell you that it's food that was sacrificed for this other idol, and then you eat it, they may think that you support that other idol, which is not the message you want to send to them. So that's kind of leading them astray.
And then this last verse, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, so that they may be saved, not seeking my own advantage. And so one of the questions I was asking you earlier about how do you deal with the challenges of diversity? How do you deal with the challenges of conflict? Here's another answer. Not seeking your own advantage. That's hard to do because we all want to see our own advantage.
Well, now look at the clause right before it, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do. I mean, Paul surely has his tongue firmly in his cheek.
Right. Well, that's part of the rhetorical part.
Paul, and on the one hand, you know, Paul talks, you know, I can be Greek, I can be Roman, I can, you know, etc. But he uses that to make his message not to please other people,
Right.
as far as I could do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Trying to please everyone and everything I do.
Well, some of this, you can tell some of this, the rhetoric, the irony that he uses a lot in First Corinthians. But that's all I wanted to point out, the not seeking your own advantage. Because I think that's one of the issues that we have to think about. I mean, it's the conflict and you have messes. To be honest, we want to have our way. We want to do, we don't necessarily seek the advantage of the other person. But once again, Paul is trying to get us to think counterculturally, to really get re-socialized. I think I used that word in the early slide. So, we need to move on, but the last line on my page, we can go into this commentary. All our actions should glorify God by seeking the benefit of others rather than ourselves. So I think that's, as we're looking for tools to deal with challenges in community, that's what I think we can look at. Let's go on to chapter 11. And this begins, as I mentioned, this begins the section on what does worship look like in community? We don't be dealing with that from chapter 11 to chapter 14. And as I mentioned, when I signed my name to this, I didn't know, I just had forgotten that this is kind of one of those messy chapters. So the point is that I put these quotes up here so you will know, this probably won't be resolved. I've read so many commentators, they're all over the map, but I wanted you to see, not the most lucid passages, Wayne Meeks, more than any other passage in this letter, presents severe problems with the interpreter case. So, some of you who read 1 Corinthians, you probably have heard some of this. I want us to, the first part deals with head coverings for women, and the second part, which is what attracted me to this chapter, deals with the word. So let's go and look at the head covering section. Now, one of the challenges we've had in reading 1 Corinthians, we have Paul's response, but a lot of times we don't know what the question was. I think when Jack and Fran talked, they had us kind of guess what the question might have been. Richard Hayes in his commentary, what I thought was kind of interesting, he wrote a letter that he thought this might be the letter that the Corinthians wrote. Yeah, this might be the letter that the Corinthians wrote to Paul to get some feedback on this issue of head coverings. So can I get a reader that wants to read that and read the letter? A reader in here. We're back.
We remember you fondly and wish that we could see you again. Some of us are trying hard to maintain the traditions you taught us, such as the tradition we learned at your baptism, that in Christ there is no longer any discussion between male and female. You would be glad to know that when we come together for worship, the women in our community continue to play a role equal to men, praying and prophesying freely to the assembly under the inspiration of the Spirit, just as they did when ye were here with us. But a dispute has now arisen on one point. Some of the women, acting in the freedom and the power of the Spirit, have begun to remove their head coverings and loose their hair when there is prophecy, as a sign of their freedom in Christ. Some of the more timid and conservative members of the community have objected to this, thinking it unseemly and disgraceful for the women to let their hair down in public. We would be grateful if you would comment directly on this matter in order to dispel any doubt about this point. We remain.
Okay, so it's kind of creative, don't you think? So let's go to the text. Let's go to Paul's response in chapter 11, and I'll read it. So I have it here on the board so you can follow along. So it starts at verse 2. I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions just as I handed them on to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head shames his head, but any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled shames her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved. Verse 6, for if a woman will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it is shameful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved, she should wear a veil. For a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and reflection of God, but woman is the reflection of man. Indeed, man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. For this reason, a woman ought to have authority over her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, Woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, but all things come from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head unveiled? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is dishonoring to him? But a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. And of course, those are not in. Okay, so what does it say?
We got a lot of women in here with their heads uncovered.
And will continue to do so.
Right, and of course, there was a period when men had their heads covered. You know, after this period, Jewish men had their heads covered, so. Well, what do you think?
What's always come, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but what's always
It's
come
not
to my,
right or wrong.
okay. What's always come to my mind is kind of what was the historical context at that time? And since he has talked a lot about the food and what's going on around, I guess I look at this in a similar way, that maybe the idol worship, it was common for the women who were worshiping idols not to cover their head.
Mhm.
So if you didn't have your head covered, it made it look like you were worshiping that idol. And then the same thing for the men. So it was some kind of, like trying to make sure they were set apart in what they were doing.
Right, and then the whole issue about distinguishing between the sexes, the genders. You're absolutely right, that was one issue, and then of course, remember Corinth is another place where a lot of people were there, so there were differences with Roman ways of operating, Jewish practices, so all of that was involved in that section. But I pulled out some of the issues, and we may not have time to go over all of these, but I pulled out some of these issues. And I'm happy to share the slides later. So I've kind of given you two from two different scholars. Ben Witherington kind of pulls out what he thinks are the 5 major issues. First of all, I think it's important to know that Paul affirms that both men and women may pray and prophesy, as long as they reflect the word of God. Many people have used this text to say that women shouldn't prophesy. It'll be interesting to see what Luke says next week, if there's a little part in chapter 14 that deals with this too. But I think most scholars agree on that piece, that this is not about women not being able to pray and prophesy. The issue is head coverings. He also says, when we talk about man being the head of woman, does head mean source or does head mean leader? That's one of the interpretive challenges of this. And then verse 11 makes clear that, and I think I underlined this in the text, men and women are mutually interdependent, not independent in the Lord. And that they ultimately come from God. Men and women share a horizontal dependence on each other and a vertical dependence on God. And then 4, the argument about nature and hair is meant to bolster Paul's contention that the distinctiveness of male and female should be outwardly manifested. And then 5, and this is the point you were making, perhaps both men and women were taking their cues from pagan customs, and Paul intends to set up new customs for new community, new community, and these customs are deeply grounded in his theological understanding of creation, redemption, their interrelation, and how they should be manifested in worship. And then I pulled a couple of quotes from Jamie Clark Souls. I want to give kind of a woman's view in here. And so this is kind of her response to this. These issues must be considered anew in each generation because one way is right, not because one way is right and one is wrong, but because the meaning that is implied by our practices can change over time. Now, some scholars don't agree with that. Some scholars say culture has nothing to do with it, but this is another view. And then finally, 2 takeaways. We're called to do church in a creative, inclusive, interdependent way. Women lead in Pauline churches. Paul assumes both genders, 2 genders were all they knew about in the first century, since they knew nothing about chromosome DNA and so on. They fill the same roles in gathered worship, and that includes prophesying. The issue instead of a cultural one, how everyone should dress. Why? And she says he thinks worship needs to be conducted in a way that highlights the distinctive values of Jesus. That makes sense. What was my sense gonna make? Okay, so let's now get to. And I really want to have this about being a community. Being a community means balancing convictions with confessions. Another thing in the toolbox. Balancing convictions with confessions. Hence the need to develop the virtues of compassion. Somebody backwards. Compassion, maturity, and the kind of love Paul presents in 1 Corinthians 13. Balancing convictions with confessions. That's from Jamie Clark's study. Once again, I think that's something for us to consider as you're thinking about how to navigate differences in community. So, last part of this chapter 11 deals with the divisions within the community in observing the Lord's Supper. And I wanted to do a couple of things to review the cultural context once again. When we read this section, Lord, remember they're in house churches, so they're not like in a building. Gentile believers, not in a synagogue. And so they're meeting in homes. And typically, obviously, you got to be in a large home. They have the wealthy people who are hosting the what they call the some people call the agape meal. It was a dinner. So within the dinner was the Lord's Supper. So it's not like what we know today as just having Lord's Supper separately. They would have a dinner like a banquet. And as part of that banquet, part of that dinner, they would have the Lord's Supper. Paul had given them the sacrament, he told them how to conduct the Lord's Supper. And so this is the context. So we're going to read these verses so that we'll understand. It helps us to understand better what was actually going on. So if we get someone to read maybe the first few verses on, well, you know, I told you what the abuses were. The wealthy people were acting as they normally acting in banquets. They would have the best food for the wealthy people. Their friends, they would grade their friends, and then the well-to-do friends would sit in the big dining room, the big dining room, and the slaves and the people of lesser status may eat the leftover foods. When the slaves would come late, maybe there was no food left. So that was kind of that's how they were abusing. They were doing what is normally done in Greco-Roman, in the Greco-Roman world. So that's what was going on, and that got back to Paul, and this is his response to that. So if we could why don't we get someone to read 23 through 26. A volunteer.
I can do that. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes."
Sounds familiar. We hear this all the time. Okay, and then let's try to take it to the end, 27 through 34. A reader, please. Anybody?
I can read. Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be answerable for the body and blood of the Lord. Examine yourselves, and only then eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For all who eat and drink without discerning the body eat and drink judgment against themselves. For this reason, many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judged ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged by the Lord, we are disciplined, so that we may not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If you are hungry, eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for your condemnation. About the other things, I will give instructions when I come.
So what is Paul saying to them? Why does this matter?
It seems like he really wants it, but equality within this congregation, which seems to be very socially structured.
Yeah, so he's trying to find some one's equality,
Community.
So in community, there's equality, is that what you're saying?
But he wants them to be community, not a hierarchy.
Yeah. Very good. Anything else? We heard that institution language and we hear all the time, particularly in high school settings.
Well, he's certainly practical when he's like, don't give me the you're hungry, too hungry to wait thing, like, you know.
Get home.
Get home and come.
That's funny, right? Hopefully, exactly. And then in that language, Richard Hayes talks a lot about how many people have misinterpreted that section about eating and drinking unworthily. He said that really is focusing on the context there, not that, I mean, none of us would be worthy to take the sacrifice. If it were, if it meant, don't do it if you want to do it unworthily. Also, this issue of discerning the body means to recognize a community of believers for what really is the one body of Christ. And we're going to have time to talk about this, but I want us to think about how this plays out in our modern context. How can we discern the body through the Lord's Supper, through the communion, through the Eucharist? I have a list of resources, because interestingly, in the Christian Century magazine this month, cover stories on communion. There's an article in Christianity Today this month about communion. So I put my email on the resources page if you are interested in seeing those articles. They have a paywall, but I've subscribed to both of those. I will send those to you. Interesting about how this plays out in a modern sense. So what's at stake? Why does this matter? This is my last one. Why does all this matter? This issue of community and worship in particular. Why does this matter to us? How can we address our challenge to become countercultural as Christ followers? Any thoughts?
It seems to me that he is giving the people of Corinth all this practical advice that is so needed. I mean, they really want answers to their questions. And he's giving this valuable advice to them, and we're benefiting from it. So that's why it's important.
Yeah, it's funny in the Richard Hayes commentary, he says, it's a good thing that Corinth church messed up, so now we really know because we didn't, First Corinthians was written before the Gospels. And so we understand better because they didn't do it. That's a good point.
I occasionally have heard more churches even advertise that we are a New Testament church, that we want to get back to the pure New Testament church before it was corrupted by all kinds of bad things like Catholicism. Well, we find here that this earliest church, this ain't no pure at all. So, and I really think we are far from perfect, but we're doing better than they did.
But we've already, you know, this is the beginning.
Yeah.
This is the beginning when they were trying to really figure it out.
I
We're trying to figure it out.
don't know, I agree with that, but Elizabeth,
And
I
I,
actually are doing better than they did.
I wanted to end because, and I guess Christian told me this is in chapter 16, but that whole thread about love, we talked about knowledge, talking about love, building up. This is in the last part of the book. And this is something, once again, the tool, something in our toolbox, like all that you do, be done in love. I think that's one of the main things. That's all I have, kept it a little longer. Thank you for your attention and see you next time. Thank you. You all right.
You know.
And a friend for Jerry and Baldwin, all these guys for Jenny.
Thanks. I just went 1 year. I had just discovered in the end. I wanted